I call the Honourable Member Carmel Sepuloni.
Mr Speaker, I'm speaking to the Victims of Crime Reform Bill. Labor agrees that victims need to have a greater role in the criminal justice process because there is a lack of visible complaints processes and oversight of victims' rights, Mr Speaker and Mr Ashraf Chowdhury. Under the Labor government, the Justice and Electoral Select Committee conducted an inquiry into victims' rights in 2007, which highlighted some of the issues that have been finally addressed by this bill, Mr Speaker. The Law Society has expressed reservations about some of the initiatives presented by the government, particularly the expanding role of victims in the courtroom, which might move the courts away from the dispassionate dispensing of justice, Mr Speaker. Labor will pay close attention to submissions in the Select Committee to ensure that both the victims' rights and the rights of the accused are balanced to achieve an appropriate and fair outcome. And as one of the members on that Justice and Electoral Reform Committee, Mr Speaker, and I can assure you that the Labor members will do that. The Law Society does support the moves in the legislation to give adult victims the right to read their statements in court, but subjecting children to further court processes might not be a particularly positive advancement of children's rights, and furthermore, the use of pictures, Mr Speaker, could be misleading. The Ministry of Justice has identified three broad concerns facing victims of crime. The first is victims find it frustrating dealing with multiple government agencies to get information about the criminal justice system, their rights and services. The second is that the mechanisms for making criminal justice agencies accountable for the information they provide or the services they deliver to victims are weak. And the third, Mr Speaker, is that many victims find the current criminal justice processes bewildering and feel that they do not have any role in the criminal case involving them. Mr Speaker, I think, as my colleague who spoke before me, Charles Cheval, said, that we do need to reflect on some of the rhetoric. We do need to recognise that New Zealand has some way to go in dealing appropriately with those caught up by no fault of their own in the criminal justice system. The rhetoric that we have listened to from the National Government over the course of the 3 years that they have been in office has been concerning at times, Mr Speaker, because the rhetoric doesn't necessarily match the action. We've seen examples where, unfortunately, victims have been re-victimised by that national government, and I think a good example was highlighted by the member Lynn Pillay in her valedictory speech earlier on this evening, when she talked about the re-victimisation of sexual abuse victims that was undertaken through ACC and the denial of counselling to these sexual abuse victims through ACC by the national government, the incredible harm that was caused there, and the fact that these victims basically were re-victimised by the system, by ACC and by the national government. After taking over the victims' rights portfolio by Lynn Pillay, it didn't end, unfortunately, and continuing on from that, actually, we saw even further re-victimisation when we saw Dr. Peter Jansen attempt to sue a victim of sexual abuse for $250,000, Mr Speaker. And that re-victimisation was horrendous in that all that had occurred was that that victim of sexual abuse dared to speak out and dared to attack the government and question Dr. Peter Jansen, Nick Smith and the national government on their decision to deny sexual abuse victims the right to counselling, Mr Speaker. So although we have heard through the rhetoric that the national government purports to stand up for victims and want to legislate in order to ensure increased protection for victims in some of the actions that have been undertaken by this national government, one does have to wonder whether or not the spiel matches what they're actually doing, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, we will be supporting this bill to Select Committee, but we will be watching it very carefully with respect to the reservations that I've expressed and have been expressed more articulately, I think, through my colleague Charles Cheval in his previous speech. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
I acknowledge the honourable member Kennedy Graham.